Today is November the 12th, 2012. My name is Tanya Finchum. I'm with Oklahoma State University, and I am here in Okarche, Oklahoma, which is in Kingfisher County, today to speak with McKemy-Brandes Lewis regarding her Centennial Farm. And this is part of our Oklahoma Centennial Farm Families project, so thank you very much for meeting me here today.
And thank you for asking me. Old Dragon's English teachers just can never resist a chance of a lecture. But I thought I'd start by telling you just a little bit about Okarche. Okarche is a very interesting town. It's OK for Oklahoma, AR for Arapaho, CHE for Cheyenne. It's a made word. And Okarche is especially interesting because the main street is half in Kingfisher County and half in Canadian County. So all of these towns were platted and plotted before people were permitted to enter. The streets were named, everything was laid out, and I cannot imagine why they would have a town half in Kingfisher and half in Canadian. But it worked out real well for the bootleggers back in the bootleggers' day because all they had to do was get that liquor halfway across the street and they were saved. That was it. There are two famous places here in Okarche. One is the bank. It's the oldest continuously active state bank in the state of Oklahoma, and they're celebrating they celebrated their 120th anniversary last week. This was opened March 19th, 1892, and the bank began sometime in November. And my grandfather was one of the earliest depositors, and he was also they also had the first safety deposit box.
And what was your grandfather's name?
Oh, we'll come to that. As I said, I'm an Old Dragon English teacher.
Okay.
I have it all arranged right here. But I've had to make some choices, and I've tried to organize it, and it just didn't come up organized. I was going to start with a couple of quotes that teachers, I also taught history, teachers like, "The past is a country to which we cannot go." So it's very hard to make a 21st century mind understand what a 19th century mind was working with. What was wonderful to them is totally yucky to us. Now I'm talking about people who looked at this as a fabulous chance, a homestead, free land, a real chance to make something, to do something, to have something. This meant everything in the world to all of our folks out here. And we were talking at a 50th wedding anniversary a week ago about how hard our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents fought to have this land, to keep this land, and to keep it for us. And it's amazing because so many of our stories are exactly the same. They had so much the same frontier experience, so much the same World War I experience, so much the same Depression experience. And the Depression, I think, is what really scarred so many of them so much. My mother never cooked a meal. She was a horrible cook, but she never cooked a meal that mattered for tasting good. It was a meal to get food on the table to feed us, and that's all, because they had all had such hard times here. Ken Burns is going to start a program on the Dust Bowl and Depression out here next week, and I'm really going to be interested to see if he understands the real horror of it and how it scarred them, a whole generation. And in turn, that generation has somewhat scarred all of us too, because we're awfully careful with our money. Get things paid off. Don't buy big things. Don't have a new car every year or 2 years or 3 years. One time I put my wedding ring out I just put my hand out and I'd forgotten about it. And Mrs. Rother looked at it and she said, "Oh, Katie Cat, honey, that's an awful lot of diamonds." And I said, "Well, Ms. Rother, ma'am," Nell Rother, "that's my wedding ring." And I wasn't wearing this one at that time. "This is my wedding ring. This is my Aunt Faye's wedding ring." Oh, well, that was okay. But to have this many diamonds, no, that would not do. The Depression might come back. So it really literally scarred all of us, and it scarred them too. I'd also offer that a Chinese proverb I just heard, "The palest ink is more trustworthy than the freshest memory." And I think it means that family memories and family history and oral history gets changed. It's told from the viewpoint of the person telling it. So there's no way I can tell what happened to them the way it happened to them. And I'm going back 4 generations here for some of it. So I have it wrong, and it's changed in the telling each generation. And I'm doing my best here as an old dragon English and history teacher to do the best I can to give you a picture of what I think happened or what I think was going on. Now, I'm not as big a help with exactly what went on the farm because I didn't live here. I spent a lot of time out here working, but I didn't live in the buildings. So I'm not going to have as full a picture of that. But I understand about the teaching, and I understand about what I think, as best I can, what it was like for people to live out here. And I suppose we should start with my grandfather, who was Pearl C. McKemy. It's either P-E-R-E-L or P-E-A-R-L, Calvin McKemy. He was the son of a judge in Ohio, and his father had died, and he had to stay home and take care of his mother and sisters. He worked at the Railway Express until he got enough money to come west. And his older sister, Ella McKemy Smith, who had married Will Smith, had made the run, the 1892 run, and they staked land right out here. So grandfather came in 2 weeks after the run with his $200 and bought the homestead, the farm, the home place that I'm still farming. It's in Altona Township. Now, Altona, I don't think was a real town. There's a church and a cemetery left. At most, there would have been a store, a blacksmith, and maybe a school. But all of that disappeared very early, and the church and the school is left. Grandfather spent 25 years on the Altona Town Council, the Township Council, and I have not been able to find out what the Township Council meant. Nobody seems to know, so I'll check on that for you. He was on the Mount Pisgah Cemetery Board, and everybody here says Pisgah, but it's Mount Pisgah, which is a name from the Bible. And he was president of the school board for Fairview School, where everybody went. He was an extremely handsome bachelor, very charming, dark eyes, dark hair. He was a little bit older. He went to the church at Altona. He went to Salem Church. He went to Mount Pisgah Church. And he lived in a dugout on his homestead. And a dugout down by the peach tree. And I think I know exactly where it was. But for this nice young man from Ohio with parents from Lexington, Virginia. So they were well educated. They were very nice to come out here and do what they call batch, in a dugout down by a peach tree on a dreadful homestead in the middle of Oklahoma where it's so hot in the summer, so miserably cold in the summer, and the wind blows 40 miles an hour all the time, and it kicks up the dust. And he just loved it. He thought the West was the most wonderful thing in the world. And he had a very good friend, Howard Householder. Howard's family lived about a mile north and almost a mile east. And Howard Householder lived with grandfather. And Howard was tall, blonde, and very, very handsome. Oklahoma was a country of young families, young people. And they heard about a little bit older family who had some older daughters, 5 very pretty daughters. So these 2 handsome young men just went right down the road to the Householders, and they married 2 of those girls. Howard married Manila Bell, Aunt Nella, and my grandfather married Zora. Her name was Alzora, A-L-Z-O-R-A, but they called her Zora. Grandfather, PC, was head of the Fairview School Board, and grandmother was a school teacher, and she taught a number of places out here. But she had taught at Fairview School every year. And grandfather hired her on September 1st, 1903, married her on September 30th, 1903, and they had to close the school. But she taught all the children, all the Coffees, the Oligs. She taught her Nunamaker friends. And I think I can tell you exactly where each one of these was. I've referenced some maps here that are available on historicmaps.com to get exactly the right township, quarter, and section number. I'll continue with him, and then I'll skip over to her and then bring their story together. Basically, he raised mules, which he sold to Fort Reno, which was not very far away. He raised alfalfa, he raised wheat, and he did manage to build a one-room house when he married. I think the one room was about 16 by 20, with 2 windows on each side and a door on this side. And bless their hearts, he built the house and they lived there. Great-grandmother McKemy came from Ohio after they were married for a visit, stayed a month in this little 16 by 20 house on this dreadful prairie out here, and she never came back. I wonder why. They had a bad storm while she was here, and they had to go to the cellar, and they spent a lot of time in the cellar running from the storms. About 1912, they added a T to this little square or almost square farmhouse, and it had 2 rooms up and 2 rooms down and it was kind of centered across this farmhouse. There was a porch built on the east side, and eventually a kitchen was built on the west side. But other than that, they, for the most part, lived in this little one-room house. That's where everything took place. Even in my time, that's where you went. Maybe you used the other rooms for company, and you'd go upstairs to sleep unless it was too hot or too cold. If it was too hot, you slept outside, and if it was too cold, you slept downstairs close to the heater. He did marry my grandmother. My mother was born in 1906, and her name was Arvie, A-R-V-I-E, Bell, B-E-L-L-E. I was so lucky to get KK as a name. We always said that my daddy thought I was worth stuttering over because I had aunts Annabelle, Arabella, Fanny Bell, Manila Bell, a cousin May Bell. Mama was Arvie Bell, grandmother was Isabel. So I got KK, and I was just real thankful. Her sister came along in 1910, and that was Faye, Aunt Faye, who was just the most wonderful, wonderful, wonderful person there ever was. Dr. Wolf from Okarche here delivered my mother, and he delivered an awful lot of babies out in there earlier in the years. Later on, it was Mrs. Gearing, and she lived in the William Gearing place in Altona Township, G-E-H-R-I-N-G, and she was a lovely lady too. Children were born on the kitchen table, not in a bed. You weren't going to take a chance with all that expensive bedding. Children were born on the kitchen table. And they had a very hard time with my mother. She was a 10-pound baby, and yes, and there was no anesthetic, and it was just pretty awful. It took a long time, and they really were very concerned about it. It took long enough that, of course, my grandfather's outside pacing away. One of grandmother's sister, Retta, R-H-E-T-T-A, came out and said, there's a terrible laundry to do. If you'll carry the water, I'll do the laundry. So they did the laundry while she was being born. And that was a hard chore because you had to carry water from the well. Then you had to heat this water. And then you had to keep it heated. And you did the laundry. You did the table linens first, then the dish towels, then the sheets, then the clothes, and then the outside things, the overalls and things like that. And it took all day to do. And you were standing out on the prairie, summer or winter with this terrible wind, and you're bent over an open fire, scrubbing clothes in a copper pot. And the copper pot was heated, and then you had 2 cold rinses. And I still have the copper pot at home. We keep firewood in it. My poor husband brings in firewood every so often, and I get after him about, don't make any dents in that valuable copper pot. My mother was redheaded, and they were not expecting a redhead. Redheads were a little unusual on the frontier. The Indians had seen redheads, but they had never seen blondes. And one of the wolves who lived not too far away, I don't know if it was Running Wolf or Wolf Come Early, one of the wolves, was kind of a friend of my grandfather, would come visit every so often. And he liked my mother's long red curls, and he would play with them. And he wanted to buy them. And then he wanted to, how much for the whole girl? So after that, my grandmother was just terrified, and she and my mother would go to the cellar when the Indians came. Mother said she spent half her life in the cellar running from the Indians, and the other half running from storms. The storms are just terrible out here. And her grandmother, Nunamaker, would bounce her on the knee and would say, "Artie Bell, we did not expect a redhead, but we love you anyway." Isn't that what? My grandfather had a lot of redheaded sisters back in Ohio and back in Virginia, but none that they'd ever seen. So being redheaded was something different. Let's see how I'm doing on my. Oh yes, Mother also said Mother must have had a lot. Mother did have a lot of life. She lived 100 years, but half her life she spent in the cellar running from the Cheyennes. And these were the Southern Cheyennes, the one who had gotten Custer, the ones named American Horse and Charging Cloud, and they still have families around here. This mud out here, this dirt, turns to mud, to red gumbo mud, and it sucks you down. And there was a terrible low place very close to where my folks lived, and my grandfather would have to go down and pull everybody out. And he never charged anybody a penny to be pulled out of that gumbo. He would always say, no, just if you see the girls, Mother and Faye, if you see the girls and they're having a problem, you just pull them out free. And I tell you, if you ever had car trouble, you wanted to have my mother or Faye with you. It was uncanny. It was like grandfather was watching over them and sending them help because somebody always showed up to take care of those two women. It was just uncanny. Okay, we've got Mother and Faye up to about 1910 or 12. I need to back up a little bit. Let's see. Grandfather was born in 1869 and died in 1945. He came from Greene County, Ohio. Grandmother was Zora Nunamaker, married McKemy. She was born in 1875 and died in 1956. And the Nunamakers had been what were called movers. They moved all over the West. They were here for a couple years and here for a couple years and here for a couple years. And I think they would probably have moved out of here, but the girls were getting married. And Grandmother Nunamaker said, "I've had it. This time we stay." Grandmother was very, very, very pretty. After she died in 1956, one of the OOHRPers came. I remember him. He kind of shuffled his feet a little bit, and he said, "Katie Cat, honey, you're real pretty. But your grandmother, she was beautiful." And now she's been dead almost more than 50 years. And I talked to a man out at the 50th wedding anniversary. She said, "Oh, I remember about your grandmother. She made wonderful light bread, and she was so pretty." When she was a child, all the kids remembered that they would put their shoes out and put straw in their shoes for Santa Claus. And I've never heard of that custom either, but she said they did that. And her description of her aunts, Aunt Cobe and Aunt Sis, back in Kansas, they went to town one day and they bought bustles, and they came home with bustles. And the kids all laughed and flipped them up, and they couldn't understand what that was. So they only wore their bustles a couple of times. My grandmother was very, very interesting. She was born just about the time Laura Ingalls Wilder was and remembered the same long winter. And she and I read The Long Winter one winter together. And I think I was hooked on history and the old days and talking to people and learning ever since. And she talked about that winter and how awful it had been for them, that they couldn't see out there. They were in a soddy in Kansas, and they couldn't see out. They couldn't get to the barn. They were very hungry because the chickens all froze to death. They couldn't find the cow. The cow was gone. It was a terrible winter, and Laura Ingalls Wilder's description of it is really pretty good. She managed to get some education beyond the country schoolhouse, and I'm not totally sure exactly what. It's lost in time and memory. But they talked about Zora going to college. Now, I don't think she went to college. I think it was probably a normal school course, which were the teachers' schools, or a summer course for teacher training, something like that. But she had more than just the ordinary education. She came with her parents from Kansas, and they didn't get here till 1896. The Nunamakers had made the land run in 89, had gotten land, and decided it was no good and went back. So a lot of people came, they wanted to stay for a winter or so, sell their land. Others came, decided it was so awful they couldn't make a life here and went back. So the Nunamakers took up a homestead, and their homestead was in Park Township, the northwest quarter of Section 30. And there was a church on that homestead. Yes, let's see. Yes, there was a church on that homestead. That was the Mount Pisgah Church. And Mount Pisgah's a Bible name. It was a Congregationalist church. And the Congregationalists had a big missionary effort. Mount Pisgah was originally Congregationalist. I think Altona was originally Congregationalist. The Salem Church and the cemetery next door, which was originally Watts Cemetery, which are all on these maps, and they're fairly well marked on them. Those were all Congregationalist congregations, but they pulled out. They left. And there was this church building left there, so great-grandfather, Jacob Nunemaker, became a preacher. And he and his wife are buried across the road in Mount Pisgah Cemetery, as are the senior household, Azor, and I think her name was Mary. They are all buried there at Mount Pisgah, and we kind of try to take care of it as best they can. The school at Mount Pisgah was on the southeast corner of Section 19, and I don't know anything about that school. Everybody who has lived around here and my cousins, nobody knows anything about that school. So maybe it was marked for a school that was never built because the Nunemaker children went over to Fairview School. This great-grandmother, Lydia Redfern Nunemaker, brought a lot of flowers with her when she came to Oklahoma, and they all died. It was so dry here the summer. So even if you planted food or flowers, they all dried up with this hot, dry wind about July. And the worst time of year here was the spring, because people could make it through the winter, but you began to run out of food in the spring. And that was the time when you had to have so much energy to put your crops in. And some people just practically starved to death. These farmers were very, very thrifty farmers. That's all that saved the ones who were saved in the Depression. And they used to have a saying that this is a large German community, and that you could always tell the German farms because the barn was bigger than the house. Houses were not terribly important to these people. The barns and the outbuildings that made the farms run were a lot more important. And I have forgotten to put down here exactly, I'll get it after we stop for a second, exactly what quarter and section everything my farm was. The Nunemakers grew up out here. They had the northwest quarter of Section 30. Grandmother taught mostly at Fairview School. It was on the northwest corner of the northwest corner of the southwest corner of Section 26 and Park Township. Oh, Fairview School. I beg your pardon. Fairview School was on the northwest corner of the southwest quarter of Section 26 of Altona Township. And that was part of the Coffee Land, the young lady who let us in. That was the Ed Coffee place. And Mrs. Coffee was Mary Coffee, or Mary Ellen Coffee. And she was just a wonderful lady. And she would always go to help everybody in the community. So when my mother or sister or grandparents were sick, grandfather would put out some kind of a towel or a sheet, and that would notify the Coffees that they needed Mrs. Coffee to come. And then Mr. Coffee would put out a sheet that would notify Mr. Aulick, Peter Aulick, who was another in the next section over. And he would then hitch up his horses, come get Mrs. Coffee, and take her down to my parents. And then she would stay until the measles or the mumps, or my mother had these terrible, terrible ear infections. A lot of children did in those days. And she would stay until they got better. And then my grandfather, when the sickness was over, would take her home. And they built this beautiful, big 2-story house, and she worked terribly hard. They were Irish immigrants. And she just worked incredibly hard and eventually developed a goiter and would have to struggle to breathe. And they did so well. She worked so hard. They built this beautiful home. And then she had this awful goiter. And she died either of the goiter or of strangulation or of heart failure from struggling with that. They struggle with a lot of diseases and things that we never think of as a disease. My grandmother's sister, Ollie, Nunamaker, had married Watkins and had moved away. And she was the other big family resource and local resource. Once they got the mail up and running, you could mail a postcard to Aunt Ollie on Monday. She'd get it on Tuesday. She'd pack her bags and get on the train on Wednesday. And they always arranged ahead when you needed her, which train she'd be coming on. So grandfather would take the horses down to the depot in Okarche on Wednesday and pick her up. And that's better train service and mail service than I can get today. Everybody out here was at the mercy of the weather. You were at the mercy of the rain, the wind, the lack of rain. And we tend to have droughts here about every 17 to 23 years. So you need to plan ahead a little bit and save your money. Save your money very much. Because the only people who lasted out here were people who had their land paid for and who had a little bit put by so that they could get over the bad years. And it was a very stressful life because a dark cloud in one end of the county meant maybe that had hail and your wheat would go down and it wouldn't come back up. Maybe that meant a cyclone, or maybe it meant just rain, just frog stomping, thunderous rain that wasn't going to come back. So it was a stressful life. Most people had 2 or 3 ways of making a living, 2 or 3 crops, or animals they raised, or something like that, because if one got beat down, then they could have another one. Grandfather raised turkey red wheat. Turkey red had come with the Russians and with the Norwegians and had come to the Dakotas. Turkey red was important because until then, the wheats that were raised out here were summer wheats, and the summer wheat wasn't dependable. Weather was bad, season too short, they lost most of them. But when the Russians brought this turkey red, it was a winter wheat. You plant it in the fall, and then you harvest it in the spring or in the early summer. So it came around and it grew all winter. And if everything's good, you've got wheat up and you can pasture your cattle on that wheat. So you got 2 crops out of it. And then you would harvest it again in the spring. Turkey red was so popular that a lot of the calico fabric was called turkey red. You will find quilts made from turkey red fabric, but it saved the American agriculture and opened up this whole middle of the section. A little bit later, my grandfather used early Triumph wheat, and it was a very good hardy wheat. It could take a heavy wheat storm and stand back up. Didn't require much in the way of fertilizer. It didn't get mold or mildew very much, but it didn't produce a lot. So now they've gone to all these crossbreeds and hybrids, mostly bred out of OSU by a man named Joe Daney. Joe Daney lived in a little tiny cabin out here very close, and he began to breed wheat seeds on his own. Have you heard about him? Oh, well, look him up at OSU because all his seeds went to OSU. And he bred seeds and worked at it for 30, 40 years. And when he died, he had everything labeled in all these little vials. And sometimes there would be 1 or 2 seeds. And the modern local wheat is all refined versions of what he got started out here. But his wheat went to OSU. Let's see. Water was extremely important and hard to come by. Some wells worked and some wells didn't. And I'm coming to the area here where things get a little bit disconnected. During the Depression, during the Dust Bowl, our well did not go dry. We were one of the few who had good, dependable water, and they would have to carry water to the garden, so they did manage to have a little bit of garden. And anybody who wanted water, come take what you want, have what you want. Grandfather never charged a penny, always gave his water free, and he didn't know whether his well was going to hold out or not. But that was, here's Mrs. Coffee across the road who needs water. How could you tell her? Or Mr. Oleg down the road? Or how could you tell people they couldn't have your water? I do remember them talking about during World War I that they did give a goodbye dinner for the soldiers who were leaving here because the army recruited and then the train came one day and everybody came to town to say goodbye to them. So they had a goodbye dinner for all the soldiers. And I believe it was Mrs. Albach who just cried hysterically about her son. And he did come home. But everybody came to town that day and said goodbye to all the soldiers. And then as young men were killed and the bodies came home, everybody stopped work, got dressed, came to town to welcome them home. And they knew when World War I was over because they could hear this incredible cacophony of sounds from Fort Reno. They could hear the guns from Fort Reno, which were all going off. And Fort Reno was a remount station. Fort Reno supplied the horses for Custer to go west on. They provided horses for World War I. And do you remember the horse Blackjack, who was in the Kennedy funeral with the boots turned backward? He was raised out there too. And it's been recently repossessed from OSU. And everybody's working really hard to make it a nice place again. Let me go back here. There were other things that stressed women. Oh, let me go back to my grandmother, the school teacher. I got a long way away from her. She homesteaded by herself, got a lottery, homesteaded by herself, out in Day County, which is now Ellis County. And she and one of her younger brothers, Ira Nunamaker, or Orrin, O-R-A-N, Nunamaker, fondly known as Uncle Irie and Uncle Orrin, would go with her to help her homestead because it wasn't safe for her to go out there by herself. After she married, they would spend half a year here in Okarche and half a year out in Day County. And they had to cross part of the Great Salt Plains to get out there, so they would always stop and gather salt. And I never quite understood that because salt was cheap. They could buy salt here. They stopped and gathered salt. I don't know why. But it was really ugly out there, and it was much worse than it was here. It was hard to make a living. The land was more barren. So eventually they sold it and bought the place next door to the farm that I'm farming now, and my sister has that. And we call it the East Place, but it wasn't. It's the west quarter, the west quarter of that, and I didn't write it down here. I'll have to find that out. But it was very, very lonely there. And I found the title that when they took title to the homestead, the East Place, and they took that title from a woman homesteader. There was a woman homesteader, Wilkie, Caroline Wilkie, I think. She farmed right next door, and there were two other women homesteaders in this township that I knew about. One was part of the Grellner family, Jim Grellner, who works out at the elevator now, was one of his relatives, and then one of the Shiremans at Omega. And that's 4 women in this township that I know about who've homesteaded by themselves. And there may have been more. There were a lot more women homesteading than we realized. But when they took title to this farm, she took title in her name. And I don't know how she managed to do that because she was a married woman and she was a chattel under the law, but the title is in her name, Zora Nunamaker McKemy. And I never understood. When she died, my mother and Aunt Faye, mother and her sister Faye, took title in their names together. Husbands were not added. And when they put it in our names, they insisted so definitely that that was their farm. We were not to have husbands on it, that was the family farm. And it must have originated from grandmother taking title of that homestead in her own name. So women homesteaded and had their own property. Women got a better deal generally on the frontier because there were so few women, especially pretty women, that they could cut a better deal than they could cut back east. And I think some of them did. Life was really, really strenuous. Life was scary. Fire was a terrible danger here because with the dry conditions and the wind, a 40-mile-an-hour wind, if your fire got started, it just raged over these prairies at 40 miles an hour. So grandfather always kept a fire break around the house and the buildings. And when a fire broke out, he would bring the horses or mules up and he would hitch the wagon. He would load the wagon with grandmother and then with blankets and anything and get her ready if she had to flee. And then he would take the most dependable of the horses. The 2 horses were Frank and Jip, but he would take the most dependable. And he would go to fight the fire wherever it was. And he would take 2 gunny sacks and then 2 2-gallon bottles of water slung on either side of the saddle and would go to fight the fire. And I can remember even a fire out here that just blew up one time in the 50s when I was a kid. And everybody came running to fight it. But they're hard to get stopped. So I didn't always understand exactly how a fire break would work here because the weather was so hot, so dry, and the wind is so bad. It always seems to me that it would have jumped a fire break, but they did have them anyway. And my mother could remember some very early memories of, and Aunt Faye could too, of sleeping in that wagon and with blankets over them and quilts beside them in case they had to run. And that must have been a terrifying thing. I think living out here, in many ways, women had a better deal, but they were still at the mercy of the weather, and they were at the mercy of their own fertility. And they didn't have much in the way of birth control. There was a little birth control, but not very much. They had vinegar douches, they had condoms, and men generally did not want to use condoms, as I think Ben Franklin said. Wasn't it Ben Franklin who said they were an armor against pleasure and a sieve against disease? So the only other thing they could do is say, tell Jake to sleep on the roof, meaning no sex. Withdrawal was practiced too, but not much. And I can remember my mother, who did not believe in birth control pills, describing this little thing that her mother used, a little douche thing that they used, a vinegar douche. Mother was very frank sometimes, which if you could get her to talking, she would talk about those. But that was about all they had. And most people had very large families out here. Even into the 60s, I remember families of 12 to 15. Oh, you need to know about Okarche also. Okarche has the distinction, and this small town has 3 school districts. It has the public school, Catholic school, and the Lutheran school. And the Catholic families always tend to be a little bit larger. They would have the 15 child families, while a lot of the Protestants had smaller families, but nobody practiced birth control much. Pete, you wash 1 day a week on a Monday, which I had described. You took a bath once a week, if you were lucky. And you'd heat the copper pot, which you did the laundry in. A lot of people brought it into the common room, and that's where you took your bath. And you'd heat the water for it once a week, Saturday night. The babies went first, then the women, then the men, all in the same water, which they added to. And I never quite, sometimes they'd use one of the round galvanized tubs. But I never quite understood how it worked out because you got sewn into your underwear in October. Your long johns got sewn into them in October, and you got cut out in the spring. So I guess you didn't get a bath all winter long. I'm not sure about that. I just didn't get that. Oh, and a lot of people wore something called asphodity, and I have no idea what it really was. I think it really was asphodita, but asphodity, and it was a little cake, and you wore it around your neck, and it smelled terrible, and it was supposed to ward off germs. Who knows? But Daddy, I remember talking about the boys from time immemorial, and Grandmother would even talk about the boys throwing the asphodity in the stove so that they'd get the day out of school, because then it would smell so bad they'd have to leave. Grandmother taught at this little school. Grandmother taught Dolly Jun. Dolly Jun was Mrs. Lum Jun, Mrs. Columbus Jun. I don't know what her maiden name was. So then she taught my mother and Faye, and my Aunt Faye then taught her daughters. And my sister and I just totally messed the whole thing up. But then by then the school was long gone. This school was a center of the community. They had always had a program and on Friday afternoons, and then and the parents could come. They also had a program for every one of the holidays. And I have a picture someplace of the Columbus Day celebration with the hats and the flags. And Grandmother was in a beautiful black two-piece suit, long dress. And all of her brothers and sisters were there, and the Coffee Kids and the Oligs and the Rothers, and were doing that one. But they also did the Christmas program. They did a New Year's program. They had box socials there. They had parties there. And they're supposed to have had dances there, but I don't quite understand how they did dances because the desks were nailed down. So I don't know how that worked out. But they did have a lot of dances out here. Let's see how far I am off tack. Let's see. Oh, the wind out here. Oh, every day you had to get up and you had to get a fire started in the kitchen because you did most of your cooking in the morning. They had breakfast, dinner, and supper. And They did this cooking in the morning with a hot fire because it was so hot the rest of the day. They'd try to cook all their food. And they would make iced tea, and they would put iced tea down in the well. And if you kept it down in the well, it was cool, so you could have iced tea during the day. The hot, dry wind seems to have bothered women the most. And a lot of women committed suicide. I know 4 who committed suicide, and 1 man who murdered his mother. And some of them are known and some aren't. The man who murdered his mother was all over the newspapers. And it was the King family, and Mrs. King knew there was something very wrong with him. The wind was blowing, it was hot and dry. And she sent the girls to get help, and by the time they got back, he had murdered her. And then he swallowed carbolic acid. And carbolic acid is a disinfectant, somewhat like Clorox would be today. So he died a truly horrible death. It just burned everything out and down. And one of my aunts burned herself, on the other side of the family, burned herself up in a haystack. Simply couldn't take the wind and the dryness and the loneliness anymore. And she burned herself up in a haystack. And that was a popular way of doing it. Women didn't seem to shoot themselves, didn't seem to slit their wrists. They seemed to do fairly dramatic things. But it was just a hard, hard life. But then, everything's a perception, because what looks like this horrible, hard life to us, to them was such a miracle. They had a free farm. They had all this new technology, new farm equipment. They had stoves to cook in. Stoves were a miracle. That was so much better than an open hearth or a fire, or working over a fire outside. So they thought things were a lot better than we think when we look back. Let's see. Oh, I told you about women and birth control pills. Oh, irons. It's so hard. We lose track of why things were important. And I was watching a television program one time, and the woman talked about the vanity of Victorian women, even on the Western March, even people, on farms, that they always had to have an iron. And some families, iron had floated down the river, and it was a terrible, terrible problem to them. They had to borrow it from one out and the other. And I just wanted to throw things at the TV and said, oh no, that iron was a terribly important part of their lives. Because when women had periods, they used rags. And there was an expression, so-and-so was so poor he couldn't keep him in rags. And these rags were all put in a pot and where they were sterilized, and then they were kept and used over and over and over, and they were washed, and then they were ironed. And they didn't know much about sanitation, but they knew to iron those rags, and they ironed diapers. The calico fabric was really rough and hard and very abrasive. So if you're stuck out here and that's all the fabric you have, you need to iron it. It's a matter of comfort, not a matter of vanity. And I'm sure this young historian had never heard women talk about struggling with some of these necessities of life. And everybody always had a baby. You were either pregnant or lactating. So you always had a baby. You always had diapers, if not rags. Okay, let's see. Oh, my great-grandparents, on their homestead, they planted a hedge of bodark trees. Have you ever heard of bodark trees? Okay, well, they're in bloom now, or they're planting. And he had this beautiful hedge of these beautiful trees, and it protected the house. But it sometimes hung over into the road, and the horses would get them. And it's all gone now, which I miss. I always looked forward to them. Let's see, in 1912, all the community got together and they brought telephones in. And they had Pioneer Telephone Company. And our ring was 2 shorts and a long. And you, of course, rang it and you got a whole party line. But in many ways, it was the early keep track of your children, because you could give the general alarm and grandmother could say, has anybody seen the girls? And anybody would say, oh yes, they're here or there. And then, where's so-and-so? Is he out in this field or is he out in that field? So it was an early make and slot. You could track anybody with those. And in 1962, they sold it. And they had put in $50, and they got $50 back. And I can remember my mother and Aunt Faye coming down to OU, and they had each kept 1/4 of the $50. So they brought me my $12.50, and they brought my sister her $12.50. And we all had a lovely lunch and laughed and reminisced about the old days. And my sister has the phone. Everybody had a pie shell, and they had a signature on their pie shell out here so that you could know whose pie that was if you went to a church supper or if you went to a box supper or whatever. And our signature was kind of a long S and had a little quote on this side and a quote on this side. And I've forgotten what the others were, but everybody had a special way of cutting the top dough for a pie, and so that you knew whose pie was whose. And grandmother had her own special recipe for peach pie, and it has come down in the family, and we all make it. And in October, October, when my cousin Charlotte came to visit, she said, "Do you still have your grandmother's peach pie recipe?" And I do, and I gave it to her and went back to the rest of the family. But they made pies out of the peaches. They made pies out. Oh, and she had made up the recipe herself. She developed it from something else. They made pies out of peaches, out of apples, out of the dried fruit that they could buy or that they could dry themselves. They made jam with peaches, apples. There was a grape arbor not too far away. They made jam with sand plums. Omega was the sand plum center. Omega kind of sits on a sand mound, and these are sand plums, and they're so sour you can't eat them, but they make the most wonderful, wonderful plums. The only trouble is sand plums are infected with chiggers. So if you go after sand plums, you better take a bath and wash your clothes within about an hour, or you're going to be miserable for the next month or two. Meals were breakfast, dinner, and supper. They had pies for breakfast. They had oatmeal. They had eggs in season. I don't know what they had for the main meal of the day. It's escaped me. I don't remember. But dinner was leftovers from whatever they'd had before. And milk and bread was a very popular dinner. It was a very popular meal. A lot of people ate milk and bread with a piece of fruit or some dried fruit or some canned things. Once in a while they had chicken, goose, turkey, or whatever they could shoot, but not very often. You didn't want to use up your chickens. You might need them in the wintertime, or you might need them for eggs. So that people talk about this, all that wonderful fresh food they must have had. No, they didn't have much fresh food. It was mostly carbohydrates. It was mostly bread. It was mostly milk, cream, butter. And then in the spring and early summer, you would have some fresh food. But then you would harvest your green beans and your lima beans and things of that nature and can them. And canning was a terrible project. You put the copper pot out over the hot fire outside, and you cooked your vegetables and your meats for hours. An hour. I think it was 6 hours for meat, potatoes, and carrots. Now, it was wonderful when it came out. But even at that, with that number of hours, there was no pressure canning. With that number of hours, it was still really hard. Okay. When the family lived out here, everybody went to church, and you went to church on Sunday. And then you had a big Sunday dinner. You came to town once a month. And town usually for my family meant coming to Okarche. If you had to go to the doctor, you would drive to Okarche, take the train to Kingfisher. If you had to see the dentist, you would take the train to Kingfisher. Because that was too far. That would have been 40 miles in one day, and the horses couldn't pull that far. And if you can imagine anything more unpleasant than having to ride in that wagon in the sun or the wind or the snow. If it were cold, they'd heat stones or potatoes and put them in their pockets. If it were hot, they were just miserable. And horses would walk 2 or 3 or 4 miles an hour. It was 10 miles to town. Horses were slow, mules were slow. Now, horses had a tendency to stop on the road. And they would stop and urinate. And they got rid of 6 to 9 gallons.
Something like that.
Yes, 6 to 9 gallons a day. And you're sitting in a wagon, and the wind is blowing 40 miles an hour. And if you're in the wrong downwind, it was a very unpleasant trip to town. If there was no way that, and I think that's one reason why cars were so important, why people would struggle and struggle and struggle and had to have cars. Model Ts were terribly important out here because you could do so many things with a Model T. My daddy said Model Ts were cussed mean to start, cussed mean to run, cussed mean standing still, and he didn't say cussed. And he knew. He knew. Now, because my mother and Faye walked to Fairview School, and they would try to take one of the horses, Frank or Jip. But Frank or Jip couldn't be spared all day to do from the farm work, so they would chase him back down the road, and he was supposed to go home. But lots of times they didn't go home. Lots of times the horses would go into the coffee barn and get a little snack. So eventually the girls had to walk by themselves, and they walked 2 miles to Fairview School and 2 miles back. And the well head is still there, and the school building is over on Judge Stroud's place. So the school building still exists, but the school does not. Let's see. Mother didn't start school until she was 8 and Faye was 4 because it was so far for these 2 little girls to walk, and grandmother was not trusting the shine. She never got over that. Because grandmother was educated, she was incredibly determined that her little girls would be educated too and would have a college education like she had, which is a little, yes, okay. So she made it a point of starting to save for those girls' education while they were still very small, a pattern which my mother started also. The day we were born, each of us, they began to buy war bonds for us and continued buying bonds or putting money away. They were both my parents were incredibly determined that we had educations. So it goes down. Grandfather would give them a calf every year, and they would raise that calf, and then they'd sell the calf, and they'd save the money. They took piano lessons from the King family, from, I think, Zella King. And Zella was one of the other school teachers out here. They took piano lessons from her, and then they gave piano lessons, all to earn money to go to college. They raised chickens and eggs. Okarche eventually got a creamery, and that was a big miracle because now you had a way to milk your cows and to take the butter, the milk, the cream to town and sell it. So they did that. And they saved forever. And they finally saved for a year at Central State College in Edmond, which had been the old normal school. So they had a year in Edmond, and they lived with Mrs. Kidd, the Methodist minister, and his wife in Edmond, and they lived with her. So they got a year's education. After that, they would teach school for the school year. Then they would go to Edmond in the summer, and Edmond had 2 summer courses, and they would get there 3 weeks late for the first one and make that work up and get the credit for 12 weeks. Then they would take whatever they could in the way of correspondence courses at home, and both of them graduated. And that was such my grandmother was so proud of that. And I guess they were too, because the latter years when they were going to school was the middle of the Depression, and there was no way. And people would talk about P.C. McKemy, what was the matter with him, sending those girls to school. Why, he could buy a good farm for what he was spending on those girls' education. But he spent it, and grandmother spent it, and they worked hard to keep those girls in school. Mother taught both at Big Four, which is one of the schools here, which was a consolidated school of 4 districts. She taught at Loyal, and she taught at Omega. Grandfather would always go and bring the girls home for the weekends if he could. But Omega was very important because that was where she met my daddy. And both of them taught school until the year that in the Depression when Oklahoma could not pay their teachers. There was not enough tax money. People, we tax and spend and tax and spend. Well, they couldn't collect any taxes. There was no income. There were no taxes. The land was blowing away. You couldn't collect property taxes. So one year, Mother did have to pay the taxes on the farm, but my grandparents paid her back. And so Mother graduated in history and English. Faye graduated in home economics. So after Mother the state couldn't pay them. And it took several months before the pay drooled in. And a lot of the banks discounted those warrants. Not this bank. This bank paid them. And against my husband's wishes, I'm transferring some of my money from California right into this Okarche bank because it held in the Depression. And it's the same family with the same attitude, with the same money. And I think my money's probably safer here than it is in California. in California. Mother became a comptometer operator. That was sort of an early fancy adding machine. And Faye went back to school at OSU and got some graduate courses and became a home economist then, and was a county agent, was the home economist with the county agent. And she had had the top county in the nation twice, Garfield County, and was in the Home Economists Hall of Fame in Washington. And I went to the agriculture department in Washington, and evidently it's now a box in the basement. They don't have a place for it because there aren't any more home economists. It's a passing thing. Let's see. I should catch you up on my daddy and bring him up to. Well, let me go ahead with this since our tape's about out, and then we'll put daddy on the next tape.
Okay.
The Depression was truly horrible. I hope Ken Burns can transmit the horror of it, because now this is not the land that was plowed that shouldn't have been. That was a little farther west in the Oklahoma Panhandle, the Texas Panhandle, a little into Colorado. Woodrow Wilson had come home from World War I, and he had seen the farming practices in Europe, and he didn't know anything about the West, but he thought, we have all that land that's just cattle land, we should put that to farming. So he arranged with Congress to pay a bounty, and I think it was $1 an acre if you would tear up your land and plant crops, which might not have been so bad, but it happened in conjunction with a 500-year drought or a 1,000-year drought. And all of a sudden that land was blowing away, that fine silt. So that even here it began, which generally we didn't have any problem, this land began to blow away. And if you had a snowstorm, a dust storm, if it were red, you'd say, oh, there goes Oklahoma. If it's yellow, oh, there goes Texas. If it was brown, oh, there goes Colorado. But we do have these cyclical droughts. And it's interesting because the land now farther west, they eventually the Depression was over, the Dust Bowl was over. And they began to farm it again and irrigate it. Now the irrigation wells have gone dry. And the Ogallala water, what do you call it? Aquifer, thank you. That's the problem with getting older. The Ogallala aquifer now is receding, and it may only last 20 or 30 more years. So there's a lot of the water wells can't get down in there, and that land has turned back into grazing land. Here, we generally don't irrigate. We usually get enough 30 some odd inches a year. But when it's a drought, it is a drought, and that's that. It blows away here too. It was so horrible here that when a dust storm came up with grandmother in the fields, Mother and Faye would take the car. They bought a Model T in 1920. And they would take the car, and they would tie one of them to the car with a rope. And they would go down the fence row. The one walking would go down the fence row, and they'd turn on the lights of the car and honk and honk and honk until he could find them and come up to the fence row with the horse. And then they would all go back to the house. And it was terrifying. You couldn't see anything. The wind was blowing away. You didn't have any food. Water wells were drying up. Your neighbors were leaving. And this wind howled and howled and howled. And they put sheets at the window, and still there was this haze of dust, terrible haze of dust. They would put extra sheets and blankets on the bed, but still at night, when you turn the covers back, there would be this silica in the beds. You kept the plates turned over. You didn't turn them up till the last minute because within 30 seconds you had dust, silica. You ate it, you breathed it, you lived with it. If you were cooking, you kept a lid on your food, or you'd have this fine film of dust. And a lot of people had what they call dust pneumonia. They breathed it in so badly that they coughed and breathed it in and coughed. A lot of people died of dust pneumonia. My daddy had dust pneumonia because he was out in it a lot. He and his father, who was the doctor, he had dust pneumonia, and it took it 60 years to kill him. He was hale and hearty and young enough, but he always had lung trouble and allergies. And when he died, there was a very young doctor, and my sister and I were trying to tell him he had lung trouble. It was dust pneumonia. And this was a young doctor who knew nothing about the Depression or the Dust Bowl, so he put down cardiac insufficiency. No, he didn't have cardiac insufficiency. His lungs finally wore out. And then I suppose his heart wore out from the trying to breathe. It finally got so bad that my grandparents did leave in 1936. Faye had gotten a job in Medill, and she was the home demonstration agent there. And Medill was far enough east and south that it wasn't as bad there, so they went to live with her. And then they went on to live in Enid, which was Garfield County with her, where she was so successful. I should go back to the Nunnemakers a minute. They farmed, and he preached, and then he was kicked in the head by a horse in the 20s and eventually had a stroke or died of the effects of that. And she had ovarian cancer and died. Their homestead in Park Township was divided amongst the children. And my grandmother saved her money and never spent it. So then I should take you, I think, over to my daddy, who was at Omega, and he lived in town and lived a somewhat different life. He was E.O., Ernest Otto, and everybody called him Doc Brandes, Brandes. He was also known as Putzie, Putze, which means little darling. There were huge numbers of Germans at Omega, and he spoke German till he was 5 years old, and Putzie was a common childhood diminutive for little boys. He was born in Omega Township, and grandfather, Dr. Brandes, said that he was born during this howling, horrible March storm, and then he just simply never quit howling. His mother was, where am I here? Oh, his mother was Isabel Wenzel, and his father was Ed Hahn. But they had very hard times, so they let Dr. Brandes and Mrs. Brandes adopt him. They had a son of their own, Herman, who was also a doctor. Herman, who studied at Epworth Methodist College, medical school in Oklahoma City, which was taken over by OU, and he also then studied at OU. And there's this horrific picture of the single little light bulb, and he's in anatomy class with the other students, and there's a cadaver, and they're digging away at this cadaver with their bare hands. I think that killed a lot of doctors, digging away at cadavers with bare hands. But Dr. Brandes was Dr. Carl Gustav, and Mrs. Brandes was Emma Mueller Brandes. They came from Germany, and they came first to Canada, then to the Pennsylvania coal fields, which are just horrible, very lawless, and she would sit with a gun every night till he got home. Then they came to Okarche, and then on to Omega. And in those days, Omega was really a pretty nice little town. Omega was 5 miles from Alpha, the Alpha and Omega. And Alpha is totally gone now. Omega has a little bit left. And they just had a wonderful reunion at the school, and they've put out a reunion book. And if that's something that you would be interested in, I will try to get a copy, because they go all the way back with pictures and diagrams and things like, and they're putting out an addendum soon, because they found so many people through this who also have artifacts. The Brandeses adopted Daddy, and then they helped grandmother become a nurse. And she was a nurse she was in 1905, so she was in nursing school in 1906-07. I think she got her degree in 1907, and she was a nurse in Oklahoma City at Wesley Hospital. And she worked so hard because the Brandeses didn't have enough to help her do everything. So she worked hard. And she would shave and bathe patients extra to make extra money because her shoes wore out. The hospital administrators, in their infinite wisdom, would stack her patients up on 3 or 4 floors instead of putting them all on one floor. And she spent her time climbing the stairs from one floor to another, and her shoes would wear out. Grandmother had a thing about shoes because they had homesteaded, and they really, truly were very, very poor. Her parents were very poor. And the first shoes that any of the kids had, they picked blackberries. And they picked blackberries. It was in the 1880s. They picked back blackberries and sold these pails of blackberries to have shoes. And they didn't fit very well. So grandmother would walk all the way to church. She'd take a washcloth with her before she turned the last corner. She'd wash off her feet, put her shoes on, go to church. And then she would come back to that corner, get the washcloth off the fence, take her shoes off, and walk home. And those shoes lasted for years. Once grandmother graduated, she taught at a hospital in El Reno. Then she taught. We taught. She was a nurse. She worked at Fort Reno, and she was there in 1907 during statehood. And I remember talking about the different operations, which were pretty grim in those days. But there was one woman out there trying to give birth, and she had to give birth before midnight, the day that Oklahoma became a state, because her child was part Indian and could get head rights. And if the baby wasn't born until after midnight, that baby wasn't going to get head rights. He didn't get head rights. But she used to describe in fairly graphic detail some of the wounds that would come in and some of the things that they did. And it was really pretty. Medicine was in its infancy. But there again, it's all a matter of perception. That was a miracle compared to what they had had 25 years before. There was medical care. They could set bones. Women began to live with the anesthetics and practicing sanitation in childbirth. I think in Queen Victoria's time, something like 90% of women died in childbirth. Not the first one, maybe the 15th one. But just a simple thing like a bladder infection would kill women. And all they could do was just drink water for it. That was just it. But bladder infections moved into the kidneys, and the kidney infections would eventually kill you. So while we look at it as something pretty awful, pretty grim, it was, again, a real miracle from their eyes. After she left Fort Reno, she came back to Oklahoma City and worked at Wesley Hospital. And then she became the head nurse at the Infectious Diseases Hospital. Do you have any idea what that was? Well, it was a containment, quarantine hospital. If you had tuberculosis, if you had smallpox, had yellow fever, malaria. Malaria was very, very bad here. Now, while malaria wasn't contagious, I think it was handled there. But if you had any of those diseases, you went to the quarantine hospital. You couldn't stay in a regular hospital. Regular hospitals were for operations and having babies and things of that, or broken bones. And you didn't want to have a broken bone. You really didn't want to have a broken bone. But she handled that. And she must have had the most incredible immune system. Daddy had an incredible immune system because he never got anything. I mean, he never even had measles or mumps, and she didn't either. And Daddy lived in the Brandes home where sick people came all the time because Dr. Brandes' office was in the home. So there was this continual parade of sick people. He never got anything. Not a thing. Daddy was just as cute as he could be. There's some pictures. He's just the cutest little kid. And you know how people in these old pictures just look stern and like this. Here's this cute little kid with this little glint in his eye. And he had pale blonde hair, which eventually turned black. So he had black eyes, black hair, and this dark, swarthy skin. And then he got me. Not what you expect. But I have a Caddo cousin whose mother was just about the same coloring that Daddy was, and she had a little redhead son and 2 little redheaded grandsons. We were real glad to see them because, people would look at Sherry and me, and it was like, oh, are those your little girls? Yes, we were. Mama was redheaded. We took after her. He was also just quite a handful. He was a little stinker. I mean, he was always running around doing something. He was just always all boy. I remember in an interview he did with this Penn Whittington at probably Oklahoma Christian College, he talked about the chores he had to do because he had to bring the kindling in and he had to go down to, you really wanted to get down to the stores in Omega after they got their deliveries because they'd have these crates out back and then cut those crates up for kindling. Otherwise, you were chopping wood all week for the wood stoves. And most everybody heated with these horrible wood stoves in the center. But again, that was a pretty important thing to them. They used coal oil lamps, which we would call kerosene lamps, and they were extremely dangerous. The first Brandes home at Omega burned from a coal oil lamp exploding, which they did. If a wick falls into it, which happens, the lamp explodes. And that means fire is just thrown around. They built a second lovely 2-story home that was just demolished a few years ago. Daddy did lots of pranks. Small towns didn't have much to do, so you had to make your own fun, and Daddy made a lot of fun. He and some kids, Omega had lots of activities. They had a band, they had a choir, And like Okarche and Altona, they had literary societies, they had singing societies, they had card societies. Especially with grandmother Zora, there were a lot of literary societies and literary things going on. And there was the Ladies' Aid. Omega happened to have a bandstand, and Daddy and some kids cut this bandstand in half one year and hauled it out into the road. Took a team of horses to haul it back. And they'd turn over people's outhouses. And everybody knew who was doing it. They knew who was doing it. And Daddy got a Model T about 1915 when he was 15 years old. He had worked in the harvest fields, and he was pretty big and strong and husky. And at age 12, he started working in the harvest fields, and the farmer didn't want to hire him. He said, look, I'll work today. If I'm not satisfactory, you don't have to pay me. Well, he was very satisfactory, so he worked very hard at the harvest and planting, and then he bought his first Model T. And he and his friends would drive up to a farmer's house in the middle of the night, bang on the door and say, well, do you have a whatever it is, a mower or a hayer or something? And then they'd say, that's a really good thing to have. And they'd run out the door and run away. One day, the Model T died. And here comes the farmer. And I guess he kind of womped on him a little bit. That lost its attractiveness. I can remember two old jokes he would tell. And they are old jokes. Are you into jokes?
Yeah.
Well, once upon a time, they had this wonderful corn crop. It was just a fabulous corn crop. And they had this huge, big ear of corn. And it was so big, they couldn't get it out of the fields. So they had to turn the pigs into the field to eat on this monstrous ear of corn. Well, the pigs ate all down one side of that ear of corn, and it destabilized it, and it just rolled over on those pigs and crushed them. That was so big of jokes. His other joke that I can remember was, the wind was so bad here. So how do you know it's safe to go out in the wind? Well, you take a lead pipe and you stick it up the stove hole. And if it only bends halfway, safe to go outside. Omega jokes. They also did other things. They had this wonderful baseball team, and one day, old man Weber gave the general alarm and said, I'm down in the well, I'm drowning, you've got to come get me. So, of course, it broke up the baseball game. Everybody goes rushing to see about him in the well. And there he is sitting on the back stoop laughing at them. They played jokes, they played tricks, because they had to make their own fun. Omega had schools, churches, stores, bandstand, band, baseball team, all kinds of clubs. And from a very early age, Daddy drove for Dr. Brandes. Dr. Brandes never got the car down. And he literally went through the barn twice yelling, whoa. So after that, Daddy drove for him. And he insisted that he was only 3 or 4 years old when he stood between Dr. Brandes' legs and steered this car. And I always kind of doubted. Oh, and that he was 10 when he really began driving and doing the driving for him. And that sounds kind of far-fetched, but are you familiar with the Abernathy boys from Frederick? Well, Bud, and I can't remember the other name, his brother, drove a brush automobile from Washington, D.C. to Oklahoma City. And I'm sure it was a stunt because their father and a chauffeur drove behind them in a Maxwell. But this brush automobile probably wasn't even longer than this table. And they were 6 and 10. And both of them lived in Frederick. One of them grew up to be an oil man. One grew up to be a judge. And their father was Bring 'em Back Alive Jack Abernathy. And he would go after coyotes and wolves. Wolfman Jack Abernathy. And he would jam his fist into these wolves or coyotes and bring them back alive and then sell them. And he'd been a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt. And these kids, their first attempt at notoriety was riding their horse all by themselves to Washington. And then they drove this car home. And there is a museum to the Abernathy boys at Frederick. You can Google it. There are a couple of books about them. So maybe my daddy really was driving for Dr. Brandes at age 10. He got his first Model T at age 15. And he was a wonderful mechanic, a fabulous mechanic. He could fix anything. And in his later life, his greatest joy was what we call the Horseless Carriage Club. That's a group of people who drive automobiles earlier than 1915. And to my poor husband's great dismay, Daddy collected cars. He left us a 1909 Rambler, which is, what would you call it, dear?
Money pit.
It's worse than a money pit, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it really is. And he left my sister the little Maxwell because she could crank it. But we got the big Rambler because my husband could crank it. And Mother got a Selden. George Selden had a patent on automobiles that Henry Ford finally broke in 1910. My sister's Maxwell's in 1908, and there's still people who remember Daddy always brought the Maxwell or the Rambler, mine's in 1909, up to all the parades and everything for years. And a man stopped me on the 50th wedding last week and said, "Oh, I remember your dad. He'd always come to the parades," and he did. The Selden was in 1910, and we're mad at Mama. We're still mad at Mama. She sold her Selden. My sister and I still have our Maxwells and our Rambler, much to my husband's dismay. What may happen to my Rambler? It's hard to drive. And we did the one thing that my daddy would so have objected to. We put a starter on it. So I can feel him thumping me on the head because he cranked it all those years and would have expected us to crank it. But we are not what he was. We are not. We can't do it. Now, he loved racing cars. He raced Model Ts. And I think one reason he hated Model Ts so much, he was driving in the old days. And he had broken his arm so often from cranking it. They had this bone that didn't heal. It wouldn't heal anymore. And he had a place on the back of his head. It ran over him one time and dragged him for a ways. And he had this little bald place on the back of his head. And one couple of his toes weren't quite right because it had run over him another time. No wonder he called him what he did. But he loved those Model Ts, and he raced them, and he had a wonderful, wonderful time out here. He always said, if you ask him where he was from the CNA country, which meant he was from the Cheyenne Arapaho country. Other people were from the Outlet, or other people were from old Oklahoma. So in the early days, everybody identified themselves where they were from. He was too young for World War I, too old for World War II. And Dr. Brandes, older Dr. Brandes, and Herman were the doctors at Omega. Herman had a pharmacy degree also, so they dispensed drugs. And Herman had broken his back in Canada, so he was somewhat hunched and couldn't breathe very well. And when World War I came along, he enlisted as a doctor, and they sent him to San Antonio. And how the Army took this man, who really was a hunchback and whose lungs were impaired, as a doctor, but they did. And the 1918 flu hit. And of course, he became ill. And Daddy and Dr. Brandes went out to visit people, and they went from house to house to house for 2 weeks. They didn't go home for 2 weeks. They stayed out, slept in the car, ate in the car. When Dr. Brandes was in the house, Daddy would sleep. When Daddy was driving, Dr. Brandes would sleep. And the most they could do was clean people up and get a meal down them. That was just, there were no drugs for it. You either lived or you died. And I think it was one of the Beelers or it was one of the Webbers came and said, "I'll give you anything. Come to my house now." And they tried to explain, there was this long line ahead and they couldn't do anything anyway. And they stayed out until somebody came and told them that Herman had been sent home, that he was very ill with the flu, that they needed to go home. So they did go home. And the Army in its wisdom had shipped him home on the train, infecting how many people, and a number of other men they shipped home to die. So they went home and they stayed with him until he was in a coma. And there was nothing that could be done. And then they went back out again and started treating people. And they didn't collect for most of it. They didn't even try to collect for most of it. My daddy was a really, really, really good man. And in 1920, Hutoka Gulker became ill with pneumonia. The Gulkers owned the bank in Okarche, in Omega, and eventually moved to town to Kingfisher. And at age 98, Mr. Gulker was still working, and he was the Justice of the Peace in Kingfisher. I remember telling Bill that we could get into any kind of trouble we wanted to get to in Kingfisher. Mr. Gulker was the justice of the peace. But Hutoka had pneumonia, and a terrible blue norther came up with a terrible ice and snow all over the ground. And she needed oxygen just desperately. And they could get oxygen to Kingfisher, but they couldn't get it out to Omega. There was no way to get it out. The storm was too bad. Daddy was 15 with his first Model T, and he said, I'll go get it. And Dr. Brandes said, no, don't. Even Mrs. Gulker came over and said, no, don't. There's no use to lose both of you. And my daddy put a sack of sand in the trunk of that Model T, took some wire cutters, a shovel, and a burlap bag, and went cross-country to Kingfisher and wired them from Kingfisher that he was on the way home. And that kid got back with that pneumonia and saved her life. So the Gulkers thought he was the most wonderful person in the world. But he took a terrible chance because he couldn't travel the road, so he'd go cross-country. And he'd have to put he'd cut the fence, go across the road, use the burlap bag and the sand to get across the road. And then he followed his tracks home. Didn't fix any of the fences. So he really was a nice man. He spent a semester at Phillips University in Enid, and then he went to Chicago, and he was supposed to go to school up there, and he didn't. He worked for a Westinghouse up there, and he lived with a German family, and this German family had never seen a turkey. So at Thanksgiving, he wired Dr. Brandes and said, send me a turkey. So they froze a turkey outside and shipped this turkey on the railway, and it got there, and these people didn't know what to do with it. So Daddy had to show them how to cook it. They'd never seen that much meat in their whole life, just an Oklahoma turkey. When the Depression came, he was running a store in Omega, and he kept it up as long as he could because Dr. Brandes had died by then. Herman was dead. Mrs. Brandes was old and frail, and he tried to keep this store up. And remember when he told us about having to take the keys, having to finally give up? And he and a friend went to Kansas City to the grocery company and finally had to turn in the keys because people simply couldn't pay their bill. They would just leave, and he couldn't keep it open anymore, and he owed them a tremendous amount. So he had this store, and he simply went broke. He bummed around the country for a while, quite literally bummed around the country trying to get jobs. He rode the rails for a while. He eventually ended up in Oklahoma City and got a job there. And he lived on a lady's porch for one winter. And sometime, I think it was a screened-in porch, but he rented this space on an outdoor porch. And he talked about if you wanted to make tomato soup, you'd go into a restaurant and you'd order some coffee, and then you'd grab the ketchup and the water, and you'd put them together and have some crackers. They always put crackers out. And that was making tomato soup for the cost of a cup of coffee. He met my mother when she was teaching in Omega. She was teaching at the Omega High School, which he had graduated from. And when they built the new school in 1928, he did all the electrical work, and he was always very proud of that new school. He and Mother dated. They went to parties. They went to dances. They went to house parties. They played bridge. They went to movies. One time, Mother borrowed his Model T to go see her other boyfriend. And this guy Lester Hale, left his hat in the back seat of the back of the Model T. Here comes Daddy with his hat saying, okay, what's this? And she just passed it off. She didn't know. She didn't do anything. Daddy knew pretty well. He knew pretty well. And one time he was taking her home, and they ran up on some people butchering a cow on the road. So they went very quickly to the George Ollig house, grabbed George Ollig and a shotgun, and tried to chase these guys down, and couldn't. So he was just always doing something like that. He finally got enough money together. He and Mother got enough money together. They married in 1937 on September 30th, which was her parents' anniversary. And then they went to Oklahoma City, where he had a service station at 4th and Walnut. And the service station belongs to the Historical Society now, and they're talking about restoring it. It's evidently all there. Then in 1942, of course, they're still struggling, they got a $50 payment. There was an oil well down the street. And in those days, they just pulled off a house, put the oil well on, and went on and paid all the neighbors, and they got $50. So they spent that $50 to move and to have a baby, me. And if you think My grandmother Nunemaker was surprised to get my mother. My daddy was surprised to get me. We always laugh and say that's how I got KK, that he thought I was worth stuttering over. The first year that I was born, it was 1942, and there were no toys in Oklahoma City. Have any idea why there wouldn't have been any toys in Oklahoma City in 1942? That was the beginning of World War II. There were no toys. Toys were not made. Cars were not made, not for the civilians. Gasoline was rationed. And Daddy had this service station at 4th and Walnut. And there was this one doll buggy in Oklahoma City. It was in the front of the Sears Roebuck store. And Daddy went to see the manager, Fay Hickson, and he took a bunch of gasoline coupons. We farmed, so we got gasoline coupons to farm. The long-distance truck drivers coming through would give him gasoline coupons for the eggs and the milk and the butter and things that he had. So he went in to see Fay Hickson. Fay Hickson, the manager, said, I know what you want, but you just can't have it. And Daddy found out these gasoline coupons. Oh, well, maybe you can. Maybe we can work out something here. So he gave him the gasoline coupons to get that doll buggy for me. But he couldn't have it till Christmas Eve. So Christmas Eve comes, and there's a blinding snowstorm. So Mother and Daddy, taking me with them, meet Fay Hickson at God only knows what hour of the night with this terrible blowing snowstorm to get that doll buggy. And he brought extra gas coupons with him in case there was a problem. And it's a good thing he did, because 2 young policemen stopped them in the alleyway of Sears and Roebuck and said, well, what do you want? What's going on here? So Daddy's gas coupons mollified them, and I got a doll buggy. A doll buggy that's still in my living room. I still have it. I have a number of family things like that. But here they were, this young couple in the worst winter, the worst darkness, blackness, just trying to make Christmas better for their baby and for them, for them too. Daddy kept this service station for a number of years. Then he had Doc Brandes Auto Storage on 6th and he was right down the street from the Murrah Building, what became the Murrah Building, 6th and Broadway. Then he went into real estate with Mother. Mother had been teaching all this time. She'd gone from comptometers back to teaching, to comptometers back to teaching, and they had moved to Oklahoma City. And they started a real estate company, Brandes Real Estate, which went right down until the 90s. And I'll jump back to Mother a minute and explain about that. He died in 1986 of dust pneumonia. And both of them, all of them, were really part of what Tom Brokaw would call the greatest generation, because they faced terrible hardship out here. Death, disease, no doctor, wind, sun, depression, Dust Bowl, 2 wars, the 1918 flu, and they survived and thrived and managed. Now the Brandeses were German, and they ate sauerkraut, they ate rye bread, they ate pickled foods. And my daddy hated pickled foods and rye bread. They had a lot of dried vegetables and salt vegetables, but they didn't have access to what the McKemies had. Let me see what I've missed here.
While your father was working the service station, what was happening on the farm at that time?
We had, after my grandparents, that was just about what I was to get back to. We had a series of tenants. One of the first ones was one of grandmother's brothers, Uncle Ira, and then a series of others. And the last one was Leonard Jarvel. And then we took over farming it ourselves again in the 50s. So that meant that we would contract farm it, and then we would come out and help, which was just wonderful. I was a child of air conditioning, electricity, and help. And my daddy believed in, if we girls were going to inherit this land, then we should know how it worked. So we would come out and help. And for all of my life, even not during my married life, if I could get home, I came home for the harvest and for whatever else and helped. My sister usually did the planting. I did the harvest. And it was hard, hot, miserable work. Even when we just sat in the car and counted the wheat tracks. And if we had to help, it was really miserable. And at the end of the day, you'd stand under the pump and just stand under some water, and then you'd fall down and get up again at 6 a.m. and work. In those days, it was very dry here. They hadn't built all the dams and all the recreation and all the ponds. So it was dry here, and you could work almost 24 hours a day if you could work. And they needed help with the cooking, help to take food to the fields, help with, they needed somebody to take things back and forth, somebody to relieve on the tractor, somebody to relieve on the truck. And it was horrible. It was just horrible. And the farmhouse finally did have electricity. And one of my cousins would want me to tell you what a miracle electricity was. She told me to tell you about it. But the farmhouse never did have running water, ever, 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 never. And sometimes in California, in the middle of the winter, when it's really raining and storming, I will stand at the sink and turn on the hot water and just watch it run for a couple of minutes. Because I remember when you didn't have water, much less hot water. Oh my, we are so spoiled. We are so spoiled. And we were talking to some of the kids a few years ago about, they were saying, ooh, look, only one little bulb. Oh, how awful. And Betta Lee and one of the Nunemaker cousins and I were trying to tell them, oh no, you don't understand. That was a miracle. That 40-watt bulb, I remember Betty saying, that 40-watt bulb lit up things like day. It was unbelievable. It was safe. You didn't have that coal oil or kerosene smell. You didn't have the danger of the lamp exploding. You weren't always dirty from the lamp black and it didn't discolor anything. Well, it was as bright as day. You could go into another room and you got light from that thing. You could close the door and you got light underneath. You could do work at night, which I'm not so sure was a really good idea for women. I think maybe it just extended a woman's day. Man may work from sun to sun, but woman works, woman's work is never done. That's it. And I think maybe that made it work. But for the first time, they could see to read at night. They could see to study at night. You could sew at night. You could come in and get something else done. You weren't tied by the storm that was outside that you didn't have any lights. You didn't have to get up at dawn and go to bed at dark. That little 40-watt thing was a miracle. The second miracle was they began to have crystal sets and radio. And all of a sudden, instead of being out in this remote place where you got newspapers once a week, and New World War I was over because you heard the guns at Fort Reno, all of a sudden, you could have a radio. Oh my gosh, a radio. That connected you with the whole world. And it was entertainment. And everybody could gather around and listen to it, which I'm not sure is such a good idea. Every so often we lose our power at home. It's kind of quiet, kind of nice for a little while until my refrigerator starts to do. But it's kind of nice just to sit down and I can't do anything. There's no electricity. Just have to sit and visit. So, but it also meant then you could have a little tiny refrigerator. And you didn't have to put the tea down in the well anymore. You could put the tea in the refrigerator. And as time went on, maybe you got a little tiny thing that would make a few ice cubes. So you could have ice cream, or you could go to the ice depot in Okarche and buy ice because they have electricity, and you could make ice cream, or you could cool things off, or you could put a big tub of ice in front of a fan and have a little bit of cooling on a terrible day. Oh my, that little 40-watt bulb was a miracle. And we look back on it as, gee, how could you have, it's all perception. To them, it was a steady improvement in their lives. And to us, it's, oh, really, now. My grandmother, or my cousin would have wanted me to tell you about that. Let's see. Oh, I used my grandmother's English book, the book that she had used when she was young and teaching, because the exercises for the English, for the grammar and punctuation, were much better than the ones that I got in my book. And she had all these little shortcuts. Do you know how to teach who and whom? Well, it's very simple. You keep the M's together. If you can substitute he, you use who. If you can substitute him, use whom. Keep the M's together. And it was full of all kinds of little things like that you just don't see anymore. So I used her teaching book. And when World War II broke out, my parents were in Oklahoma City, and Faye and grandmother and grandfather were in Enid. It was an 80-mile train trip. And they sent me on the train by myself as a little tiny 2-year-old, not quite 2. And I had my own little suitcase, little tiny suitcase. I had my own chair, and I had my lunch. And they gave me to the conductor, who was somebody we knew very well, or I wouldn't have been sent. And it took an hour and a half, I think, to get to Enid. And these were troop trains. And I can remember they were troop trains going to Vance Air Force Base. And I can remember all these men on this train. And I was supposed to sit in my little chair. You think I sat in my little chair? I had the best time. I skipped up and down those aisles. I talked to all of them. I just had the most wonderful time. I just thought that was so great to get to go to Enid and visit grandmother and Faye. And can you imagine nowadays putting a child? But they weren't the least bit afraid to do it, and I had a good time. And this conductor was somebody we knew and trusted, probably a relative. But I can't remember who he was. But I had a great time. My grandfather eventually died of stomach cancer in Enid in 1945. Grandmother died in 1956. Faye married Roy Sport, S-P-O-W-A-R-T. They moved to Oklahoma City, 2 blocks away from where we live. We were on 25th Street, 2124 Northwest 25th. Just sold the house in 1998, I think. And they lived 2 blocks away, 2105 Northwest 27th. And they paid $500, too much for the house, because Daddy and Roy knew they would save the money in gas, oil, and tires going back and forth, because we would make 4 or 5 trips a day between the 2 houses. And grandmother died in 1956, and it was very sad, because she was my incredibly brave, incredibly beautiful, well-educated grandmother. And she just sort of slowly left. She slowly slid into one of the dementias and died. And it was horrible to watch her slide into this. She had truly been very, very brave. When she and my grandfather lived out in the country alone, just right before they left, there was a poker game in the neighborhood. And 5 men decided that 1 man had been cheating. And they were quite liquored up and going to hang him. And he made his way to my grandparents' home, very bloodied and beaten up and in pretty bad shape. And grandmother and grandfather took him in. And the other 5 men came to get him. Grandfather was almost blind by then with macular degeneration, retinitis pigmentosa. So he could see light and dark, and he sat back a ways with a shotgun across his lap. And she went to the door and talked to them. And she said, absolutely not. And she said, I know you. I know your parents. You went to school to me. You will not have him. And she stood there and backed them down, drunk and angry and liquored up and all the things that men get. She backed them down. And in the early days, the trains running through here were not always honest with their weights or how they would add up the shipping charges. So she would go on the day that the local people were going to sell their wheat, and she would stand there and add it in her head. She had this incredible mind. She really was very smart. This incredible mind for math. I can't even spell math, but she had an incredible mind for it. And she stood there and watched. And a lot of people didn't speak English very well. So as she slid into melancholy and dementia, the community really protected her and took care of her. But it was terrible to see her slide into that, and nothing could be done. And she just sort of like wasted away. So she just slipped away, faded away in this cloud of dementia, and it was not good. There was a saying, Oklahoma was fine for men and mules, it was hell on women and horses. When Mother and Faye started at school, at Fairview School, and Mother was 8 years old, so it'd be 6, 8, and 1914, they had to have their tonsils out. So Doc Wolf would set up his office here. All the kids would come to town, drive to town. That was, at least a 2-hour, 3-hour drive. They would put them in the chair. They'd slide a wire behind the top of the tonsil and go click. Then they'd slide one around the bottom of the tonsil and go click. Do it on the other side. Cauterize it. And the kids would get out of the chair and go home. I know. Yeah. And I said, well, Mother, didn't you have a sore throat or something? She says, well, yes, I guess we did for a while. But Every fall he would do that. And I guess that was fairly common. And she said, I asked her if she ever remembered anybody bleeding to death or getting an infection. No. I wonder how much safer we are in our hospitals. I have a concern about our farm, and it is a real concern. As I look into the future, I'm very concerned about what we're doing to our land. We have a creek. Now, this is an Oklahoma red mud creek. This is not a New England babbling brook. But when I was a kid, you could get trout and catfish out of there. I haven't seen a fish in decades, not in decades. And you could drink out of it. It made Mama crazy, but you could drink it. I wouldn't drink out of it now. It smells funny. There's something wrong. And if you stand down there and look and realize the amount of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers that are being used in those fields around it, and the number of cattle being grazed on the pasture, that's all draining into my creek, which drains into Kingfisher Creek, which drains into the Cimarron, which drains into with towns taking water out of that along the way, and farmers, irrigating with it. That concerns me a great deal. That really is frightening, and I don't know what to do about it. And it's every creek and every river in this country. So I don't know what to do about that. And the newer wheats are a lot more fragile than the old wheats. They go down, that's it. They don't come back up. If they shatter, it's all over. They require a lot more herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers. Now, they yield a lot more, but what are we paying for in the yield? Are we really making more at the end of the day than what they made with old early Triumph that didn't require the herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers? You didn't make as much. You had much simpler equipment that could go through and get it. You had a longer window to get it. Didn't turn over and shatter as much. Are we making wise choices here for our health and for other people's health? So that's a real concern to me. And you had asked me about what we did with the farm. When Leonard Jarville moved off, we took over farming it for ourselves. And the Rother family, Vince Rother and his sons usually farmed for us, but they contracted for them. They would put it in, and we'd pay them. They'd harvest it, and we'd pay them. Vince Rother is the one and Ed Rother, who still live here, still help me out as best they can.
Put it in wheat.
Yes, we put all in wheat now. Well, you put in what the government tells you can put in, but it is in wheat and in pasture. So you put what the government lets you put in. And we're the farm several years ago that Chesapeake Oil Company fracked a well wrong out here. And there was a farm going up with oil, with gas all over the place, and everybody was terrified that gas would get on fire and explode and they'd have a fire underground. We're the farm it went up on. And the Coffees across the road saw it and warned everybody. And it was really scary. And it's interesting that the young lady who showed us in here is a Coffee. And of course, she doesn't know me, but I know her. I know who she is. The Rothers generally took care of that for us. And then at some point, Mother lived to be 100. And at some point in the last few years, she switched over to the Coffee family who are across the road. So they still farm for us now. Mother lived to be 100. Would you like all the information about her?
Sure.
Well, she was in the real estate business, and she was something else. She was redheaded. And she worked. She always worked. By 8 o'clock in the morning, she had that girdle on. She was sitting at the kitchen counter, and she was ready to get to work. And she'd been in the real estate business since 1948. And a friend called and said, would you please help me? Would you be the broker in my insurance office? You don't have to do anything. Well, within 6 weeks, she had that office shaped up. And she worked there for about 20 years. And she was head of the county mental health, the county mental health, whatever, the civilian group that supports the county mental health. She was a vice president of, she was head of the Women's Association at the First Presbyterian Church. She was vice president of her church circle. She was head of the mental health, whatever that is. She took plants to the old folks in the old folks home, the 70-year-olds, and here she's in her 90s. And she at age 92, we made her retire because she couldn't see anymore. She couldn't write her contracts, and she couldn't drive. And that was the worst mistake. It was just the worst mistake. But she was still farming. She was still doing all this. She got other people to drive her. She was still playing the oil business, and she was pretty good at the oil business. She played the stock market. She was good at the stock market. And she lived to be 100 and just sort of faded away at the end. Her mind was quite good until the end, and she just slept a little more and more and more. She would not go to the doctor. She would not go to the doctor. She was always 40 pounds overweight. She ate that worst possible Southern diet. Everything was fried. Even the salad dressing was made with bacon grease. She cooked with what cooking she did. She hated to cook with the bacon grease can. I started my married life with a bacon grease can on the stove. But her food was just terrible. And her idea of exercise was walking out to the mailbox if she had to. And she lived to be 100. She got hit by lightning in 1944 when my sister was a baby. And she got mugged in the late 80s down at the First Presbyterian Church. And the women in the hospital called me and said, "You're going to have to come and get her. We can't keep her anymore. She's driving us crazy." So I had been trying to time my trip home till just before she got home. I brought her home, and let me tell you, I can see why she drove them crazy. She had all this energy, and she worked right until the end, doing everything she wanted to. But I was kind of waiting for my husband to get back, because after she died and we were transferring things over, my husband's an accountant, so he handles most of our business and things like that. He said, "Give me the farm contracts." And I said, "What farm contracts?" He said, the farm contract you have with the coffees, about the management contract. What do they pay you? "We don't have any contracts, Bill." My husband, the Yankee, almost hit the ceiling. "How do you do business without having contract?" "On a handshake, Bill. I know where they live. We've known them for generations. This boy's great-grandmother saved my mother's life a number of times. My grandfather gave them free water. I don't need a contract, Bill. We just shake hands." And we have teased my poor husband about being the Yankee all these years. We've been married 48 years. And he really does have wonderful Confederate ancestors. My daddy was so upset when I was going to marry a New Yorker. He was really upset about that. But about 20 years after we got married, I guess, cousin Mary Catherine Curtis Lewis sent us letters from Bill's great-great-grandfather. And they had been camped at the Battle of Pea Springs the night before Pea Springs. They were camped with Pea Ridge. And they were camped with all these Indians, and the Cherokees, the Penn Cherokees, were naked and painted and were going to take scalps. But the Choctaws and Chickasaws were there also, and they didn't. And I took that to my daddy and said, "Look here." Oh, I can't tell you how much better my daddy thought of him, how much more he thought of him. He really did. But it's just a difference in culture. He really is a New Yorker. But after Mother died, we had to buy a truck. We have to have a truck to haul the Rambler, and then to get out here and get around. And my husband did not want me to buy a pickup truck. Not on your tintype. That wasn't in his plan. Well, about love and first sight. My husband and this pickup were just like this. And he's become an Oklahoma pickup driver. All you need is a what?
Gun rack.
That's right. Of all the things I think his mother never would have forgiven me for, I think this is the worst. And he and this pickup just love each other. And it means he goes over to Alameda every week as a docent on the USS Hornet, which is one of the last of the World War II aircraft carriers. And he has to go through a very bad area of Oakland. And this big black truck says, "Don't fool with me, guys." But I think my mother even would just die that I bought a pickup for my husband. That my pickup has become his. Okay, you had asked about the oil. Yes, we have oil. My husband was an accountant, and we spent 2 years in Brazil, and I taught school there. And all of us would go down and see Senior Nelson, the local Macumba fortune teller, and he was wonderful. He would throw these shells. And he kept telling me that I was psychic. I knew that. All the nunna makers are psychic. We know that. And that I could really do better with my being psychic. And he spoke Portuguese, I spoke English. So I had to take a translator. And you didn't ask him questions. You wrote out your questions and put them in the purse. And so he was throwing shells, and he says, "Oh," and he's smoking this cigar and blowing it in my face, and there are chickens running around. This was an interesting thing. And he was doing this, and he said, "Oh, I see, your mother wants to know about the oil. Well, tell her it will be along the seam where the red and the black soil goes together." Guess what? That's exactly where it was. And it was within he said it will be from here to here, and it was within that time frame. He was very, very good. Because we do have red soil and black soil, and it's just like, okay, there they are. So we do have oil, and that's wonderful. And that has, I think, mollified my Yankee husband about me keeping these farms.
About when did you discover that, though? Or what time period were they built, the
We were
wells?
in LA, so it was around 80,
In the 80s.
1980,
Mhm.
81, somewhere in that time frame.
But within the time frame that Senior Nelson said.
Before your, or after your father, he died in
Before my
86.
dad, he died in 86. It was before he died, yes. And that really has been nice money to have. It really has. Because for a number of years, if I had sold it, I'd have made a great deal more money just putting it in the bank and collecting the money. But not after the way my folks worked so hard to keep that for us. And we have moved. I've lost track of it. We moved 14 times the first 18 years we were married, or 18 times the first 14 or something. And this is home. This is home. I still know people here. I know people I've known for generations. And this has a stability, and I almost don't know how to tell you. Farmers hang on to your land. You just hang on to it no matter what. And we don't have children. My sister doesn't have children, so I really don't know what I'm going to do. But over my dead body will that farm or the Rambler go. I can remember my grandfather telling me to hang on to your land. And it may have been foolish, because grandfather came out because his sister was across the road, Aunt Ella McKemy-Smith. Her family went on to California and made a fortune, so maybe we're doing the wrong thing. But it just means home to me. And it means that I still have a place in a stable community. I still have people to talk to that I've known for generations. I like the culture here. I just like it very much. And I don't know how to tell you why I hang on to it. Why do I hang on to it? My sister's the same.
It's home.
Because it's home. And there was a saying on the frontier that, your really good friends were the ones you dug graves with, because nobody would come out and dig the graves, and you had to dig graves. And the worst, hottest summer day in the world, we've dug graves with all of these people. And some of them are just some of them aren't, but some of them are just wonderful. And I like this culture. I live in crazy California, where an awful lot of people are not Americans anymore and don't want to be Americans. Here, everybody's pretty American and pretty nice. And there's something terribly seductive about having men open doors for you and say, "Thank you, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Let me get that for you, ma'am." Oh, yeah, I can go with that. I can handle that, believe me. You'd also ask about the house and the house buildings. Okay. When my grandfather built the house out there, some of the Cheyenne had told him not to build the house there. That was where the big wind came. So he did it anyway. And I think there was a storm early 1910, whatever it was, that damaged the house. There was another storm in the early 30s that damaged the house. And then the spring of 61, there was a terrible cyclone. It took the house south of us, it took us and all our buildings, and it took the Oligs. I've forgotten which Olig it was. It took an Olig a mile north, made the news. Really, it took everything, just wiped it clean. Everything was gone. So that was the end. And that meant that we weren't ever going to stay out here much or be out here much. So we went back and forth to Oklahoma City, which was 35 minutes away. And after Mother moved out close on the Northwest Highway, it was even a shorter time. So it was very sad to see it go, but it was okay too. It never had running water, and it was deteriorating. Nobody was living in it. We didn't even come out and stay in it. We like air conditioning. We're spoiled.
Do you envision building on it and retiring to it? No.
No.
No? Too
Too
far from
far.
anything,
Yeah, it is.
isn't it?
Well, and as you get older, you've got to worry about medical.
True.
Now, you're not that far, but I mean, we've talked about, retiring to someplace else in California, but at some point you're gonna be back again because you've got to be near medical facilities.
And we're about 25 minutes from Stanford Hospital, which is a very fine hospital. And I've had 2 major cancers. I struggle with lymphedema, and I'm having some heart problems now. So I could be in real trouble if I moved out there.
Not to mention the wind.
That's right, not to mention the wind, which sometimes feels very good, feels very free for about 5 minutes.
How often do you come back to Oklahoma?
We make it about twice a year. As long as my folks were here, I made it more. And especially as we were traveling, I'd have to come home. I'd just have to come home. Because we owned the house in Oklahoma City more than 50 years, and I never got my room dismantled. And when Mother built her new house, we just simply transferred my room over because I spent so much time at home. And Bill spent a lot of time at home with me, too. It's hard to get to New York, where his folks were. And then when we moved to Brazil, we spent 8-9 weeks here.
Yeah, something like that. It was from early October to early December.
Waiting for our visas to come through. So it's part of the home thing. And as the Nunnamakers had helped my grandfather build this little one-room place when he married grandmother, then grandmother and grandfather helped my parents with their first house. Mom and Daddy helped us with our first house. So it just kind of, we had a closer family relationship than a lot of families in California have. There's this farm thing about, or this Oklahoma culture thing about. And people are so nice here. I just called the bank and said, I'd like to do an interview. And Dave Crittenbrink said, oh, of course. Well, then they had
Closed for Veterans Day.
Veterans Day. So he said, let me call the insurance company next door. And I don't know anybody here that I know. I do obviously when I walked in and there's a coffee sitting at the desk. And they said, why, of course, we'd be happy for you to. They don't know me, nothing. I wouldn't be treated like this in California. They'd have a guard at the door and I'd show my ID and, aren't you through yet? Are you ready yet? So I like the culture back here. Really, really nice. I might move back.
Well, moving back is one thing. Moving back to the farm is quite another.
That's true. That's
Yeah.
true.
And there's nobody out there now. Even the coffees are moving to town. There's just nobody there. And you had asked about how I'd seen things change. Now, I remember it was very dry here with no trees. There just weren't trees. And I can't believe all these trees that have grown up. Where did they come from? I think even into my parents' time, trees didn't grow out here, or the Depression had gotten them, or the bad droughts we had in the 50s, which kind of scared me a little bit because we got caught in a couple of dust storms out here. And my parents told us how much worse it was in the 30s. So I hear people talk about how very bad things are now, and I think, no, they're bad, but they're not what they were, what these people survived.
That may be a good place to end. Thank you so much for your time and
Well,
sharing.
thank you too. Thank you very much.
Yeah.